Hello and welcome to the Dyslexia Mom Boss podcast, the show that helps you not only feel empowered and knowledgeable, but confident and a boss mom in the dyslexia journey. I'm your host, Dr. Lauren. All right, hello, welcome back to season 3 of the Dyslexia Mom Boss podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lauren, as you well know. So I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Monica McHale-Small. So I have to say, before we hop into meeting Monica, I remember we met actually on Twitter. I believe it was 2 years ago, and it was based on a social justice post that I put out. And I love that. And I know I was on a podcast for LDA of America. So much to really delve into today. So let's really delve in. So my question is going to introduce our guest, because our guest is just amazing and has had so much experience in this field in so many capacities. So Monica, you're a mom to a dyslexic, former school psychologist, former superintendent, and now Director of Education of Learning Disabilities of America. So I would love if you can share a little bit about your journey and how is that really challenging for you in any of those capacities of those roles that you've worn. So go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of share a little bit about that.
Okay. So as Lauren already said, my name is Monica, and I've had a lot of different roles in this field. So I'm going to kind of back up and start from the beginning. I was a school psychologist and, did all the school psychology training at a very reputable institution and got out there in the field. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're trusting me to do this on my own. And, I was doing evaluations and deciding if kids had disabilities or not, all the while thinking, do I really know what I'm doing? And, as we all know, dyslexia is probably the most common learning disability. I mean, we need better data to absolutely affirm that, but probably. And many kids who struggle with reading, struggle with word reading. And most of the kids who were coming to me as a school psychologist were kids who are struggling in reading. And I remember that I would decide if this child learning disabled or not. And I would say, your child has a learning disability in reading. And the parents would be like, oh, okay, great. Is it dyslexia? And I would say, oh, no, it's not dyslexia. We don't use that term, because I was trained and I was being a good little school psychologist that we don't use the term dyslexia in the school settings. But the more I said that and the more I listened to myself and the more I was unable to answer the really good questions that parents gave me and asked me, the more I realized that even though I had my credential, I needed a lot more training. So I like to say that I became a student of reading and did a lot of reading on my own, attending workshops on my own, and just really trying to figure it all out. And in the midst of all that, I didn't have children, or my children were not yet school age when I became a school psychologist. My first year as a school psychologist was my daughter's, my oldest child's first year in school in kindergarten. And all of my kiddos struggled. Like, that sound symbol connection, that just was not something easy for any of my 4 children. And a couple of them ended up with IEPs, and a couple of them were able to kind of just have a 504 and a lot of support from home. But in any case, so that was kind of intersecting at the same time that I was trying to learn more as a psychologist. I was also struggling to be a mom to a kid who was struggling. And there's a lot of emotion around that. And I don't even think in the beginning, I still wasn't using that term dyslexia. So I understood that my daughter had a learning disability. I could see it. And with all of that, and even though I was a school psychologist, and even though I'm a strong advocate for public school, there's a lot of emotion, a lot of anxiety, because I also know the misperceptions of teachers and educators of kids with disabilities. And I do think this is improving. But at the time, there were a lot of teachers who saw kids with learning disabilities as being less than or not as smart. And I knew my daughter was smart, but I knew in school she was really struggling and she was very shy in school. And I saw firsthand people underestimating her abilities. So there was all that going on as a parent while I continued to develop as a professional. I remember, I think it was around 2004, the assistant superintendent in the district where I was working at the time took a bunch of us to see Sally Shaywitz. And that was
Yes.
life changing. That was definitely
Yeah,
life changing
definitely.
because I was like, oh my gosh, yes, dyslexia. That is what I've been seeing and what I've been telling parents we don't say and we don't use. And I guess really from that
Right.
moment on, I became kind of like I like to call myself a reading warrior and a dyslexia advocate. It's like, yes, this is what it is. We know what it is. We have to stop not using the term that's very appropriate to use. So I just continued to learn and grow and understand more about dyslexia. And as my career grew, I realized that I wanted to have a broader impact. And I decided to
Mhm.
go into administration. It really wasn't my idea at first. The superintendent at the school district where I was working kind of suggested it to me. And at first I was like, oh, absolutely not. Are you out of your mind? There's no way I want to go into administration. But eventually I
Yeah, it's
started
a tall
thinking about
order.
it. It is a tall order. And he convinced me that maybe this was the way to go to have a bigger impact. So I did that and I
Right.
became a director of student services. But I figured, okay, if I'm going to go in this direction, I might as well go all the way. And to have an even greater impact, you really have to have some influence over curriculum and what we're doing in the schools. Because
Yes.
as a school psychologist, it was very evident and continues to be evident that a lot of kids who struggle, it's a failure of curriculum. And there's nothing wrong with these kiddos.
Yeah.
We're just not teaching reading
Hmm.
correctly. So I did make that move over to the regular education side. I became a director of teaching and learning and then an assistant superintendent. And as an assistant superintendent, I had a supervisory capacity over the curriculum side of the district and then eventually a superintendent. And I was very determined to bring what I learned and knew about dyslexia and the science of reading to my work as an assistant superintendent and then later as a superintendent. All the while still being a mom and
Okay.
still struggling with negotiating that piece of having kids who struggled at school. And especially when you're somebody who really
Hmm.
values education and you have kids who struggle with learning, it can be a challenge. I train future school psychologists right now. And one of the things that I really stress is that you can have all the knowledge in the world. And, I was supervising school psychologists and principals and curriculum directors, and I knew a whole lot about reading and curriculum and learning disabilities. But when I walked into an IEP meeting for one of my children, I was
Yeah.
nothing but a mom. And I had all the anxiety that I hear from, other parents. It doesn't go away just because you are quote unquote the expert. But I do realize that
Right.
I had a lot more information and resources to be able to navigate that situation. And just knowing how I felt inside going into those meetings, it just made me an even stronger advocate for parents because I constantly am thinking about the parents who don't have that same level of knowledge and resources. So it drives a lot of the work that I do now.
Wow. Okay. So that was a really amazing summary of your story. And I think that the moms who listen to this podcast, I think really resonate with hearing other moms' stories. So knowing that you gave the professional side, but also that vulnerability of, even though I knew all this stuff, I was still anxious going into IEP meetings. I think that that really goes to show we really have to feel equipped. And really, as I always say, this is why this podcast exists. Like, I really want this to be a resource for really parents. But I'm a mom, you're a mom. That's why it's called Dyslexia Mom Boss podcast, but really for parents to know, because when we don't know, we're ill equipped and we don't know how to navigate that space. So I really appreciate you bringing the mom role in. And most of these questions are really going to come from the superintendent role because I actually have a colleague of mine who was sharing that her district does not believe in the science of reading and how she's gone to her superintendent to really push and push. And I know that a lot of these things come from the top. So let's focus on your role as a former superintendent. What parents of dyslexics who aren't getting the right support and accommodations need to know from a superintendent's perspective? And I know that that is very loaded, and I know that you can't speak for all superintendents, but I guess I just want to give parents a peace of mind to know, like, I mean, some people think superintendents are assholes, and I'm not saying you are, but I mean, it's just that I know when I was in public school, there was a lot of anger, like, well, they don't remember what it's like. They don't remember, what it's like to be on the front line. So I know that parents are feeling that. So I want you to share, and I know it depends on the district size as well. What do they need to know in regards to parents, having dyslexic kids, getting that support and accommodation? What can you offer them?
Okay, well, like you said, it's different in district. It's different from superintendent to superintendent. But here's what I think I like to focus on, right? The vast majority of people who go into education do it for the right reasons. They are child focused, and they want to see kids succeed. So I think that as a parent, if you focus the conversation from that perspective, of telling the story of your child and what your child needs, and focusing on the outcomes and what you want for your child, that can be beneficial. Stories really can change practice. And we know that's true in the political world, right? We look at all the laws that have been passed around dyslexia screening. What did that was moms telling their stories, moms and dads and kids telling their stories. In a lot of ways, the superintendency is a political position. It's why I didn't last in it very long and decided to retire early, because it really wasn't the job for me. Because you are as a superintendent, there's a lot of stakeholders that you are accountable to, and you have to please to keep your job. So there's a lot to navigate. There's a lot to juggle there. But if you can appeal to the humanity of the people in charge, I think you always get a lot. And focus on what it is that your child is doing and isn't doing that you need to be addressed, rather than going in and demanding like a specific program. Or even parents who say, my kid has to have an IEP. Well, maybe not, because it depending on the district, you have to see what's available, right? In the district where I was superintendent, I did get a lot of teachers trained in Norton Gillingham. It was a mix of special and regular ed teachers, or interventionists and reading specialists. So to get that intervention, the kids in that district at that time did not have to have an IEP. So you really want to focus on what is it that you're seeing that your kid is struggling with? What do they need? And asking the superintendent or the assistant superintendent or the principal, how are we going to get what my kid needs? And making it as non-confrontational as you can. Now, I understand frustration. Believe me, I had times when I went in as a parent and I was confrontational because you just get to the point where you're just done. But the more you can keep it a conversation, keep it focused on wanting the best for your own child and other children, I think that the more ground you'll be able to cover and get what your child needs. Although I am not going to pretend for one moment that it's not going to be a struggle in a lot of places. You said you had a friend whose district doesn't believe in the science of reading. Well, yeah, there's a lot of that, including the school district where my little grandson is, a first grader right now. And I had a conversation with the assistant superintendent of that school district, because typically, and this is something that maybe everybody should know too, typically it's not the superintendent that really drives the curricular decisions in a school district, especially larger ones. There's usually a curriculum department or an assistant superintendent or a curriculum director. Those are probably the people, when you have concerns about what's going on in the classroom as far as instruction and intervention, they're probably the people you want to touch base with first, because they have more direct influence over it than the superintendent. The superintendent, the reason I left the job after 3 years was superintendent spending an awful lot of time worrying about buses and sports and snow days and things that really had very
Oh,
little to
wow.
do with. Yeah, I'm not saying that there isn't any of that, but there's just so much to running a school
Sure.
district that the superintendent is
Yes.
pulled in a
Yes.
lot of directions. So kind of
Yes.
figure out who really is in charge of the thing that you are seeing is lacking in your school district and try to approach that person first. You might just save a lot of time, right? But back to this conversation I had.
Yeah.
So this person was a former colleague. So I knew him and I was frustrated
Okay.
because
Okay.
my little grandson, who is, I think he's going to be okay because we've been working with him since before he even got into school. But that, just like his mom,
Mhm.
that sound symbol connection thing, it's just not coming
Struggles.
very fluently and automatically. And they're using the three cueing system. Now they do foundations, but what they do is they do foundations
Right.
and
Right.
then they do reading workshop and teach him to guess. So
Right.
all that good work that they're doing in foundations, they're undoing it when they get to the reading workshop portion.
Exactly.
So I called this assistant superintendent and said, "Hey, how are you doing? It's great to hear from you, blah, blah, blah." Really kind of concerned about
Buttering him
going
up a little
on,
bit, right?
buttering him up, reminding him that we used to have a great working relationship. And
And then hit him with the jugular.
right, then hit him at the jugular. And then I said, "I'm really concerned with what's happening with my grandson because you're not giving him
Right.
what he needs." And I explained it. And I was really dismayed because here's this person who is in charge of curriculum in this very well repudiated district in this area of Pennsylvania saying, "Oh, Monica, there's a new approach to teaching reading that comes along every few years. Just because this
Oh
sore
gosh.
thing is the latest fad." Well, you can imagine that was not a moment where I
Yeah.
remained non-confrontational. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of assistant superintendents, curriculum people who don't know the science of reading. And an
Right.
awful lot of people who are in administration do come from secondary school experiences. So they're even
Yes.
farther removed from that
Yes.
teaching of
Right.
foundational skills. So you have to be very
That makes
mindful of
sense.
that. There's a lot of educating. And parents, I have to give credit
Right.
to dyslexia parents because they have really raised awareness. And because of the work
Mhm.
of groups like Decoding Dyslexia and others, people are starting to pay attention and are learning a lot of stuff that they should have known. I'm not excusing it, but
Yes.
they're finally starting
Yes.
to pay attention. So that's a good thing.
You touched on a lot of great nuggets that I hope people are jotting these notes down. But I definitely want to say it's very validating for me to hear your advice from a superintendent's role of essentially educating the educator and really understanding that parents need to know certain things. So I actually have an episode in season 1 called Educating the Educator. And
Hmm.
my whole season 1, if those of you who are listening not listen to that, it's pretty foundational. I actually give you tools on how to self-regulate before IEP meetings. I actually share a story about a mom who was so frustrated, as you said, as a mom yourself. And I mean, it really wasn't funny, but she was so frustrated at the teacher who just did not know her child, did not follow the IEP, where it turned into papers being thrown at the meeting, the teacher cursing. I mean, it was really bad. And my team leader and I, we had to end the meeting because we weren't getting anywhere and we had to reschedule. And so the first season of this podcast really gives you tools on how do you pour into your cup? How do you get yourself educated? Because more than often, as frustrating as it is, you as the parent unfortunately have to educate your child's teacher on, hey, this is what works for my child, or hey, my child's dyslexic, or hey, we're in the process of getting him tested or her tested. Can we partner together? Because we don't want this to be adversarial. Like you had said a while ago, and I truly believe this, we go into education for the greater good of inspiring children, of making a difference. We don't go in for the summers off and the amazing paychecks. We go in for a greater reason. And so when it gets to the point where parents are yelling and throwing papers at IEP meetings, that goes to show how, as you quoted, kind of done. I'm done. Like, why is this not being addressed? Why is this curriculum not being implemented? And I think that that's where I find interviewing so many moms, that's where that frustration point really is. And so it actually leads me to my next question, which I know this is a really hot button controversial topic, but so is science of reading, as it always has been. But let's talk about the podcast Sold a Story. So Sold a Story by Emily Hanford, who is a journalist, 6-part episode about why American schools have failed American children for the last few decades, which is just mind-boggling, but it's the truth. So in this podcast, it was just eye-opening for many teachers, parents, and even students, I think she said, were like, wow, this is why I'm struggling in reading. So when you were a superintendent, and I think you kind of touched on this, but it sounds like you knew obviously about the science of reading given your experiences, and you said you've trained your teachers in Norton Gillingham, but like, did your district use and support science of reading curriculum? And what did that look like? Did you have screeners? I mean, what did that look like in your district? And also, I want your opinion about the podcast too.
Okay. Well, let's talk about my district. Yeah. So as I said, I moved over to the regular ed side of education so that I could have more influence on curriculum. So in the district where I was assistant superintendent, I was really fortunate. It was just wonderful timing, right? Because I had a curriculum director. Actually, I forget the title. She was in charge of elementary curriculum, language arts curriculum. And we were of like mind. And I think that's really important when you're trying to make change in a district. I've gone it alone at times, and it doesn't go as well as when you have allies. So I had an ally in this curriculum director, and I think we had at least one principal on board, and she had found out about the Super Kids curriculum, which at the time was owned by Roland Reading Foundation. Now I believe it's Zaner Blauser. Now we decided we were moving forward with it. It was a district that was very diverse, but it had a pretty significant number of lower socioeconomic status. So our reading scores were not where they needed to be. It was problematic, and we knew we needed to do something. So we had the data to show that what we were doing wasn't working. We had a coalition of people who understood and believed in the science of reading, even though we weren't necessarily calling it the science of reading at that moment. And we found this curriculum that we believed really met the needs. The thing that was a hard sell is that it's a K-2 curriculum, and it was developed by Pleasant Rowland. And Pleasant Rowland is the American Girl doll person, and she created this reading curriculum. I think she actually had created it on her own when she was a teacher before she launched the American Girl dolls. But what
That's
heard,
a fun fact. I did not know that.
I know, it's pretty cool, isn't it? I learned this when we were implementing this curriculum, and she was frustrated by kids who couldn't read. Remember those great books that came with the dolls? Kids who couldn't read the books. So
yes, I used to have them.
Yeah. So Pleasant Rowland decided to take some of the money that she made from the American Girl dolls and develop this curriculum that she had been using or had developed herself when she was a teacher. And that morphed into Super Kids. It's a K-2 curriculum. And that is a hard sell because for whatever reason, in the world of education, we like to think of things as being like K-6 or K-5 and then secondary.
Right.
So once we got through the idea that, if we do this K-2 curriculum, we're going to teach the vast majority of the kids all the decoding skills that they need, all those foundational skills. It's not just decoding. It definitely has a very strong comprehension piece. But because we had that coalition of like-minded people and we had the data that showed we needed to do something different, we were successful in putting that curriculum in place. And then when I got the job as a superintendent, the district where I was superintendent was a different kind of district. It definitely had far fewer kids that were low income. It was a more affluent school district. But when you really looked at the reading scores, the kids were not where they should have been, especially given the resources in the community. And again, I had the good fortune of finding some like-minded folks I was a first grade teacher, one of the reading specialists, and an interventionist. And I shared with them about the success we had with Super Kids in my previous school district. And we brought in the Super Kids, the people to do an overview of the program with our teachers and our principals and our administrators. And what's great about that is that overview was really a crash course in the science of reading. So teachers, it wasn't just teaching them about what this curriculum was, but why this curriculum was important. And luckily, the teachers were sold. Some of them, the second grade teachers, were a little bit a harder sell than the KM1. But ultimately, the teachers were sold. They made the decision that they wanted to implement. My idea was that we would wait until the following school year, but they decided they liked what they saw enough that they wanted to start to implement mid-school year. We did that, and the pushback, interestingly, was from the parents, and especially from our affluent parents. Yes, and it was intense pushback. And I have since, because there are definitely parents who believe that phonics is beneath their children, that when they saw their kids reading those little predictable text that they believed their children were reading, they were very into what letter level their kids was at, and this would be something they would share and brag about.
Level. Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there was very vocal pushback. And we held firm. I had the support of the board, but it wasn't easy. And I honestly don't know that they're continuing to use that curriculum anymore since I've left there. And that's something that does happen. When your assistant superintendent leaves or your superintendent, it's not unusual at all for schools to make a 180 change and
a shift.
Yeah.
And you had said something a while ago about your colleague who made the comment about, the reading stuff changes every few years. And I actually remember one of my colleagues I used to work with in public school. Gosh, and when I left, he was teaching for 40 years. So it's probably been like 45 years now if he's still teaching. But I just remember he said something similar. Obviously, he wasn't at the level where your colleague was. He was still a classroom teacher, but it was a similar mindset of, well, why do I really need to invest in this thing now, knowing that they're just going to change it again in 3 years? And I just feel like that inconsistency, or not even inconsistency, maybe it's just that mindset, really is not helpful. And I think that really, to touch on the Solda story, it's fascinating to me that these power women, Lucy Calkin and Countess and Pinnell, just kind of sidestep the research that's been out there for decades. And it's just, I don't know. I mean, I personally feel like, obviously there are a lot of complexities to this, but I personally feel like there's always a money component. Like you had said a while ago, being in the role of a superintendent is very political. Well, I know that I'm in the state of Maryland, and I know that working with Baltimore City folks, Baltimore City struggles with actually using the word dyslexia. And I feel like it really stems from the top. What curriculum are they using? Is that curriculum working? What are their scores looking like? What are all these components? And I think it's just not an easy answer. So I don't know. I just had to touch on that. What were your thoughts about the podcast in regards to what was shared and disclosed with the world about our reading in America?
Well, I love the podcast. I loved her earlier podcast. I've assigned the podcast to my graduate students at Temple University because I think she's done an amazing job of taking research and translating it into very easily understood and digestible bits and pieces that get people excited to learn more. And it even relates back to what I was thinking about getting ready for this discussion with you, that what helped in my districts when we implemented that science of reading-based curriculum was giving the teachers the information of why this is important, how kids learn to read, what the research really says, in a way that's digestible to them and uses non-academic language to make it really translatable to to practice. And I think that's what Emily Hanford has done with all of her podcasts. I am so grateful for Sold a Story because it's like what I described with my grandson's school, where they use foundations and then they undo it with reading workshop and writing
By doing the
workshop.
3Qing.
Right.
Right.
I mean, I've only worked inside of school districts in Pennsylvania, and most of them have been in the greater Philadelphia area, but that's how it's done. Either they don't have the foundations component at all, or they have it and they slap it on to the reading workshop model and it doesn't work. So I was very, very grateful. And yeah, I think some of the pushback that I've seen on Twitter has been unfounded because I don't think anywhere in there she's saying that, it's only phonics. That's been some of the complaints.
Right.
Yeah, she never said that. She talked about why it's missing or how it came to be missing. I mean, I think we're going to be realizing the detrimental effects of the pandemic for a very, very long time. However, I do think that one of the positives of the pandemic was that parents saw how their kids are being instructed in reading.
Yes.
And they're like, this doesn't make any sense. What do you mean?
Doesn't make any sense. There were parents in the first, 2 or 3 episodes talking about how they went to kindergarten with their kid. One of the moms, I will never forget this quote, but this is what most parents think who are not educators. I just thought I'd send my kid off to school and they'd know how to read. And then my kids I think the kid's name was Charlie. My kid came home and he was reading these books, but then I realized he was memorizing them. And then I'd sit down and I'd challenge him and I realized he couldn't read. And that was obviously the start of the podcast and really the opener that I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to listen to every single second of this because yes, that is what's happening. And it's totally unacceptable. And here's my theory. I'm not against, I understand people are for balanced literacy. I'm not saying like totally get rid of that because there are kids who don't necessarily need structured literacy because they're not struggling readers, but that doesn't mean they can't benefit from it. It's very similar to saying, if we're going to have accommodations for 5 kids in the class, but they're actually best practice teaching, then let's just apply it to all learners in the class. And so I feel like there has to be a balance between if we have these kids who really are struggling to know their phonemes and graphemes and blending those sounds together to create words that's going to impact their reading comprehension, why are we ignoring that? And I think that's where I struggle, where, I spent 4 years of my career in specialized private schools where I didn't know anything about balanced literacy. I only knew the Orton-Gillingham approach. I only knew structured literacy and the science of reading. But then once I got to secondary and public school and I was teaching 8th grade English language arts, and I'm like, these kids are struggling. How do we protect their ego? They're 13-year-old boys who can't read and write, but then at the same time, they're trying to prove that they can kind of fit in with their friends, but it's a lot cooler to be sent to the office because they can't read. So it's just like, there has to be that happy medium. And I know this could be totally another episode within itself, but I don't know. I mean, that's my biggest struggle, where I just feel like that podcast shared so much knowledge, so much information. And I know it's controversial. People are angry about it. And I know Lucy Calkins going back and updating her curriculum and swears she just didn't know. And I just have a really hard time understanding how she didn't know. But I think a lot of it has to do with money and publishing companies and contracts and all of those things that no one wants to actually admit. But I mean, she's living pretty comfortably knowing how illiterate our country is. It's really not funny, but I mean, it's out of control.
It's not funny. And I agree with you. I have a really hard time believing that she didn't know. But I think that, and we have to give credit where credit's due, thanks to Emily Hanford, not just as Sold a Story, but even prior to Sold a Story with her hard words that, she put the pressure on. And I think that's why Lucy Calkins has added that phonics component, because she couldn't not anymore. But I was also thinking, I'm not going to say that there's no benefit at all to the reading workshop model. And that was one of the things that we kind of struggled with in the district where I was superintendent. We did have teachers who were trained in that, who really loved it. And so my response was, okay, here's the thing. We get all the kids through K-2 with super kids, and we get most of our kiddos decoding and reading words great. And Super Kids works on oral language development. It's not, like I said, it's a comprehensive curriculum. It's not just phonics. And then once kids can decode, fine, do reading workshop. But reading workshop is meaningless if the kids can't read the words in the books.
Exactly.
That has to be the starting place.
Yeah, I agree. And I say that all the time. I mean, how can kids love to read if they don't know how? And I think that's where the struggle comes. But anyway, Monica, we are coming to the end of our interview, and I do want to ask one last question about LDA of America. So if you can kind of share a little bit about what the organization offers, is there anything dyslexia related that can be a great resource to parents? Just give us a little elevator pitch about what LDA of America can do to support parents.
Okay, great. I like this opportunity. So Learning Disabilities Association of America, we are coming up on our 60th anniversary year. It was founded by parents.
Congrats.
And it was founded with parents working with professionals. So back in April of 1963, Dr. Samuel Curric first used the term learning disabilities at a conference in Chicago that was organized by parents. And at that conference, the parents and the parent groups who were from all over the United States and Canada, they came together and formed one organization. And that organization originally had another name, but soon became the Learning Disabilities Association of America. I have been involved with other organizations, but I'm very passionate about LDA for a couple of reasons, because it continues to be parents and professionals working together. We have an awful lot of folks that have the lived experience as either parents or individuals who they themselves have learning disabilities. We have a very strong focus on adults with learning disabilities, and we're focused on all learning disabilities. Dyslexia is probably the learning disability that we know the most about, and it's probably the most prevalent, but like I said, we still need more research. But it's not the only learning disability. It's not even the only learning disability that impacts reading, right? There is growing research around comprehension deficits, that there are folks out there who can crack the code and read the words, but they still struggle with the comprehension piece. There are disabilities that impact writing, like dysgraphia. There's disabilities that impact mathematics, like dyscalculia. There are related disorders, ADHD. So our focus is really on all of those. We have a wealth of resources related to all the different learning disabilities, including some that are still controversial, like nonverbal learning disabilities. Our membership is very inexpensive, and as a member, you have access to tons of webinars that we've recorded over the years, and we push out webinars very frequently. A lot of them are free to members. And what else do we have? Articles. We have LDA Today, which comes out, I think it's monthly. And much of what we push out is very parent focused. We also have a long focus on public education, right? So the independent schools for kids with learning disabilities and learning differences, they do a wonderful job. And we have many of those folks connected with LDA. But we also know at LDA that most of the kids with disabilities are in public schools. So we have a very strong focus on policy advocacy to support individuals with learning disabilities in K-12, in college, and career. So that is LDA.
Yes, that's amazing. The link will be in the show notes for those of you who are interested in learning more. I knew LDA had been around for a while, but I didn't realize it was almost coming up on 60 years. And I think the grassroots part is very inspirational. You know, again, as you said before, parents talking and sharing their stories makes a difference. So I think that is fantastic. We've touched on a lot of great things in this episode, and I think that I really hope that it resonates with our audience, and anyone who's listening to this, please pass this episode along to other parents who might need to hear this, might need the validation, and might need to hear the perspective of a mom, a former superintendent, school psychologist, all of those amazing hats that you've worn. So Monica, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on my podcast. This has been such a rich discussion, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.